In the final years of the Second World War, Hamburg was no longer the proud port city that had once connected Germany to the world. By 1945, it was a landscape of shattered brick, twisted steel, and hollow silence. Entire neighborhoods had vanished under waves of bombing, especially during the devastating raids of 1943, known as Operation Gomorrah. Over the course of just a few nights, firestorms consumed streets, shelters, and families. Temperatures rose so high that asphalt melted. Tens of thousands of civilians died, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. What remained was not just physical ruin, but psychological collapse. When the war officially ended in May 1945, there was no celebration in Hamburg. There was only exhaustion. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Nazi regime had fallen. Adolf Hitler was dead. But for ordinary civilians, especially mothers with children, the end of the war did not mean safety. It meant uncertainty. Food supplies had already been critically low before the surrender. Transportation networks were destroyed. Farms struggled to deliver produce into the city. Warehouses had burned. The rationing system barely functioned. Daily caloric intake for civilians dropped to dangerously low levels. Many survived on little more than watery soup, thin bread made from substitute flour, and whatever could be scavenged from rubble were traded on the growing black market. Children were especially vulnerable. Malnutrition spread quickly. Hospitals had limited medicine. Clean water was unreliable. Disease lurked behind every broken wall. Hamburg now fell under British control as part of the Allied occupation zones agreed upon after Germany's defeat. British troops entered not as liberators in the traditional sense, but as occupiers responsible for stabilizing a defeated and hostile nation. Their orders were strict: maintain order, prevent unrest, disarm any remaining military resistance, protect supply depots, follow rationing protocols carefully. Resources were limited for them as well. For German civilians, the sight of British uniforms in their streets was a daily reminder of defeat. Only months earlier, propaganda had portrayed these men as ruthless enemies. Now those same soldiers stood guard over warehouses filled with food, fuel, and medical supplies. To starving families, the presence of guarded storage buildings created a cruel contrast. Behind those doors were crates of canned meat, flour, and powdered milk. Outside stood mothers who had nothing left to give their children. Many German women had lost their husbands in the war. Some were widows, others simply had no news. Prisoners of war were scattered across Europe. Letters rarely arrived. A generation of women suddenly found themselves solely responsible for survival. They stood in ration lines for hours, clutching small paper cards that promised portions too small to satisfy growing children. Some traded family heirlooms for potatoes. Others dismantled furniture to burn for heat. And yet, despite the bitterness and hunger, something unexpected began to form in the ruins. British military authorities quickly realized that total collapse in northern Germany would create chaos that could spread instability across Europe. Starvation could lead to riots. Disease could spread beyond occupation boundaries. So beyond maintaining control, the British were forced to confront a difficult moral and strategic question. How do you treat a defeated enemy population that is on the brink of starvation? The answer was not simple. Britain itself had endured years of rationing during the war. Supplies at home were still scarce. Shipping routes had been threatened by German submarines only months earlier. Every crate of food sent to occupied Germany was a crate not sent somewhere else. Many British citizens questioned why former enemies should receive assistance so soon after the devastation of London, Coventry, and other bombed cities. On the streets of Hamburg, this tension was invisible but deeply felt. Civilians saw soldiers distributing limited rations through official channels, but strict regulations prevented uncontrolled handouts. Discipline mattered. Fairness mattered. If one family received extra, others might revolt. The occupation depended on stability. Among the rubble were countless private moments of desperation that never made it into official records. Mothers who skipped meals so their children could eat. Children who searched through debris for anything edible. Former shopkeepers who now stood in line like beggars. Pride dissolved quickly when hunger tightened its grip. Winter approached with particular cruelty. Without proper heating, apartments became freezing shells. Broken windows were patched with cardboard. Smoke from improvised stoves mixed with the lingering dust of destruction. In these conditions, survival was not about politics, it was about the next piece of bread. British soldiers, many barely older than 20, witnessed this devastation up close. They had fought through Europe. Some had lost friends in combat against German forces. Yet now they patrolled silent streets, filled not with armed enemies, but thin, exhausted civilians. The war had ended, but its consequences were written on every face they passed. In this fragile environment, trust did not exist. Fear did. German civilians feared punishment, humiliation, or indifference. British soldiers feared unrest, hidden resistance, and the possibility of losing control. Both sides carried memories of violence. It was within this atmosphere of ruin, hunger, and silent tension that small decisions began to carry enormous weight. A glance could mean suspicion. A gesture could mean hope. In a city where everything had been destroyed, even the smallest act had the power to ripple outward.
When British forces formally assumed control of northern Germany in May 1945, their mission was defined by caution, discipline, and uncertainty. The war in Europe had ended, but peace had not yet begun. Germany was divided into occupation zones, and Hamburg fell under British administration. The responsibility placed on the British Army was enormous. They were not simply soldiers anymore. They were governors, police officers, and crisis managers in a land that had just been their enemy. Many of the young men entering Hamburg had fought across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Some had seen the aftermath of concentration camps. Others had lost close friends during battles against German divisions. For them, stepping into a destroyed German city created a strange emotional conflict. The uniform they wore symbolized victory, but the faces they saw were not soldiers. They were civilians, many of them women, elderly men, and children struggling to survive. The British government had prepared occupation directives even before Germany surrendered. Soldiers were instructed to remain professional and distant. Fraternization was officially discouraged. They were to maintain authority at all times. Order had to be preserved. Germany's military structures were dismantled. Nazi symbols were removed. Former officials were investigated. Curfews were imposed. Weapons were confiscated. Every action was meant to prevent chaos or a resurgence of extremist influence. But reality on the ground was more complicated than official paperwork. British supply lines were stretched thin. The United Kingdom itself was still under rationing. Food, fuel, and medical equipment were limited everywhere. Shipping resources into occupied Germany required political justification back home. Many British families questioned why their former enemies should receive assistance when British cities like London and Coventry were still recovering from bomb damage. At the same time, military leadership understood a harsh truth. If millions of German civilians starved, instability would spread. Hunger leads to anger. Anger leads to unrest. And unrest could threaten Allied control across Europe. The occupation was not about revenge, it was about preventing collapse. British soldiers were briefed carefully. They were told that discipline was not cruelty, it was stability. If one soldier handed out food freely, others might follow. Soon, crowds could gather, supplies could disappear. Fair distribution systems would break down. The line between kindness and disorder was thin. Yet daily patrols exposed soldiers to scenes that no training manual could fully prepare them for. Children in oversized coats, women digging through debris, elderly civilians pulling carts filled with scraps of firewood, former German soldiers, now disarmed, walking silently through streets they once defended. The contrast between wartime propaganda and post-war reality was striking. These were not faceless enemies anymore. They were exhausted human beings. The British Army also faced another concern: security. Although Germany had surrendered, isolated resistance was still feared. There were rumors of hidden weapons caches and underground networks. Soldiers were trained to remain alert. Every interaction with civilians carried an element of caution. A simple approach from a stranger could be harmless or dangerous. Inside their barracks and temporary headquarters, British troops discussed what they were witnessing. Some felt sympathy, others felt resentment. A few believed Germany deserved its suffering after years of aggression across Europe. Still, many were too tired for hatred. They had survived a global war. What they wanted most was to go home. But home was far away. Instead, they stood guard over ration depots, government buildings, and transportation hubs. They enforced curfews. They inspected identification papers. They monitored black market activity. They followed strict chains of command. The official ration system allocated minimal calories to German civilians. It was barely enough to survive. British soldiers, by comparison, received structured military rations, not luxurious but stable. This visible difference created quiet tension. Civilians could see that soldiers had food. Soldiers could see that civilians did not. Moral questions began to surface in small private moments. If a soldier saw a hungry child staring at him, what should he do? If a mother asked directly for help, was compassion a violation of discipline? Regulations were clear, but conscience was personal. Some officers reminded their men that the occupation was temporary. The long-term goal was reconstruction. Germany would need to stand on its own feet again. Stability now meant recovery later. Policies were slowly shifting toward rebuilding infrastructure, restoring utilities, and reopening basic services. But these processes took time. Hunger did not wait. For the average British soldier on patrol in Hamburg, the occupation was no longer about battlefield courage. It was about restraint. It was about navigating a fragile balance between authority and humanity. Each day presented small tests of character that no one had anticipated during the fighting years. And in this fragile landscape, where discipline met desperation, it would only take one unexpected encounter to challenge the invisible rules that governed both sides.
By late 1945, survival in Hamburg had become a daily negotiation with hunger. Official rations were not enough, and winter made everything worse. Coal was scarce. Bread was thin and often stretched with substitute ingredients. Soup kitchens were overcrowded. The black market flourished in alleys and damaged courtyards where cigarettes could be exchanged for potatoes and family heirlooms traded for a few ounces of flour. For mothers with children, pride became a luxury they could no longer afford. She had once lived an ordinary life. Before the war, her husband had worked near the harbor. Their apartment had been small but warm. There had been routines: school in the morning, market visits in the afternoon, church bells in the distance. Now the harbor was damaged. Her husband was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front, and the apartment building had partially collapsed during the bombing raids. She and her children shared 2 surviving rooms with broken windows covered by blankets. Every morning, she calculated portions with painful precision. 1 slice of bread divided into 3 pieces, a watery soup made from cabbage leaves and scraps. Sometimes she pretended she wasn't hungry so her children would eat more.
but children are observant. They saw her hands tremble when she stood up too quickly. They heard her stomach growl in the quiet evenings. Rumors moved quickly through ruined neighborhoods. Some said British soldiers occasionally looked the other way when civilians searched for discarded supplies. Others claimed strict punishment followed anyone caught begging near guarded depots. Stories grew larger with each retelling. Fear mixed with hope. One afternoon, after hours in a ration line that yielded almost nothing, she made a decision that felt both dangerous and necessary. Her youngest child had developed a persistent cough. Her oldest had begun to look alarmingly thin. She had nothing left to trade. No jewelry, no hidden valuables, only desperation. Near one of the British-controlled storage buildings, soldiers stood guard. Crates were stacked inside, flour, canned goods, powdered milk. She had seen them unloaded days earlier. The sight had stayed with her, so close, yet unreachable. She watched from a distance at first. Approaching an occupying soldier required courage. Propaganda during the war had painted the British as merciless enemies, but reality had already begun to contradict that image. These soldiers did not shout. They did not burn what little remained. They stood quietly, rifles slung, faces tired. Still, fear lingered. What if she was arrested? What if they humiliated her? What if her children saw her turned away? Hunger overruled pride. With slow steps, she crossed the damaged street. Rubble shifted under her worn shoes. The soldier on duty noticed her approach immediately. His posture stiffened, alert but not aggressive. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The air felt heavy with everything their countries had done to one another over the past 6 years. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. She did not ask for much, just a little food for the children. She gestured toward them, standing a short distance behind her. They avoided eye contact, as if already expecting rejection. The soldier listened. Regulations were clear in his mind. Rations were controlled. Distribution followed strict channels. Unauthorized handouts could create problems. If word spread, crowds might gather. Supplies were counted carefully. Discipline mattered. But standing in front of him was not an abstract enemy nation. It was a mother, thin, exhausted, her coat too light for the cold, her children silent and pale. Seconds stretched. In those seconds lived the entire weight of war. Bombed cities in Britain, destroyed neighborhoods in Germany, lost friends, missing husbands, political decisions made far above their lives. Neither of them represented those vast forces completely, yet both carried their consequences. Around them, the city remained quiet. No crowd had gathered, no officer stood nearby, just one soldier and one desperate woman in a street that had already witnessed too much suffering. He could refuse her. That would be the simplest choice. It would follow protocol. It would avoid risk. She expected refusal, perhaps even harsh words. Instead, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, something shifted. Not yet action, not yet mercy, but the recognition that the war may have ended on paper, yet its moral questions were still unfolding in moments like this. What he would decide next would not just affect one hungry family. It would test the invisible boundary between former enemies and something far more human.
The soldier looked at her for several long seconds, fully aware that what he did next could carry consequences. Military discipline had been drilled into him for years. Supplies were counted, rations were recorded, deviations required explanation. Even a small discrepancy could raise suspicion. And yet, standing before him was not a strategic problem. It was a mother whose children were visibly starving. He glanced briefly down the street. No officer in sight, no gathering crowd, just the distant sound of boots on pavement and wind moving through broken windows. The city felt suspended between destruction and recovery, as if waiting for someone to define what peace would actually look like. Without speaking, he reached into his own pack. What he carried there was not abundant. British soldiers were not living in comfort. Britain itself was still rationing food strictly at home. But inside his field ration were items that meant the difference between weakness and strength. A tin of meat, hard biscuits, perhaps a small portion of powdered milk or chocolate. Items designed to keep a soldier functioning. Items never intended for distribution outside official channels. He paused again, understanding the weight of the decision. If he handed it over, he would be breaking protocol. If other civilians saw, it could create expectations he could not fulfill. If reported, he might face disciplinary action. And yet, doing nothing suddenly felt heavier than the risk of acting. He removed a small portion from his supplies. Not everything, but enough to matter. He stepped closer and placed the food into her hands. For a moment, she did not react. It was as if her mind refused to believe what was happening. She had prepared herself for refusal, perhaps even humiliation. Instead, she was holding actual food, real, solid nourishment, given by a man who only months earlier had been her nation's enemy. Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hold back. She nodded repeatedly, unable to form words. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. The children stepped forward cautiously, staring at the unfamiliar packaging. The soldier avoided dramatic gestures. He simply gave a small nod, as if to say, "Take it and go." There was no speech about forgiveness, no grand declaration about humanity, just a quiet act in a ruined street. But quiet acts can travel far. Within days, subtle changes began to ripple through the neighborhood. The woman told no dramatic story, only that one soldier had shown unexpected kindness. She did not describe him as heroic, she described him as human. In a city where bitterness could easily have hardened into permanent hatred, that distinction mattered. Other soldiers faced similar moments, wordless exchanges, small offerings, a piece of bread, a cup of tea, not officially sanctioned programs, but individual choices. Not every soldier acted the same way. Some followed regulations strictly. Others felt compassion override resentment. Each decision contributed to an atmosphere that slowly began to shift. British command soon recognized a larger reality. Conditions in occupied Germany were deteriorating faster than anticipated. Malnutrition rates were rising. Public health risks were growing. Reports indicated that without increased aid, unrest could spread. Strategic necessity began aligning with moral responsibility. Policies gradually adjusted to allow broader food distribution under controlled systems. Organized relief efforts expanded. The soldier who had shared his rations likely never imagined that his private act reflected a broader turning point. Occupation strategy across Western zones was slowly evolving from punishment and control toward stabilization and reconstruction. Preventing starvation was no longer seen as generosity. It was seen as essential to long-term peace. For the mother, however, the significance was immediate and personal. Her children ate that night. Their coughs softened slightly in the days that followed. Strength returned little by little. Survival, once measured hour by hour, began to feel possible again. More importantly, something invisible had changed inside her. The uniform she once associated only with fear now carried a more complicated meaning. It still represented defeat, it still represented occupation, but it also represented the possibility that not every enemy remained an enemy forever. Trust does not rebuild overnight. It grows in fragments, in shared glances, in unexpected mercy, in moments when someone chooses restraint instead of cruelty. Hamburg was still in ruins. Buildings remained shattered. Food remained scarce. Political uncertainty remained heavy. But in that brief exchange between a desperate mother and a cautious soldier, the rules had quietly shifted. The war had been built on division, propaganda, and dehumanization. Peace, it seemed, would have to be built on something else entirely. And sometimes it begins with something as small and as powerful as a single ration shared in silence.
The winter gradually loosened its grip on Hamburg, but the scars of war did not fade with the snow. Entire districts still stood hollowed out. Bridges required repair. Rail lines functioned only partially. Factories that once powered the port city's economy were silent. Yet beneath the visible destruction, something less obvious was beginning to take shape. A slow reconstruction not only of buildings, but of relationships. The British occupation authorities increasingly understood that maintaining control was no longer enough. Stability required recovery. Starving civilians could not rebuild a city. Children weakened by malnutrition could not grow into a functioning generation. Public health reports warned of long-term consequences if food shortages continued. Disease outbreaks would not respect occupation boundaries. Economic paralysis would threaten the broader European recovery. Gradually, structured relief programs expanded. Ration systems were reorganized. Imports increased where shipping allowed. Agricultural production in surrounding rural areas was encouraged and better coordinated with urban distribution. It was not immediate abundance, but it was measurable improvement. Caloric intake slowly rose. Markets reopened under supervision. Schools began functioning again, even if classrooms lacked proper heating. For many civilians, the shift was subtle but meaningful. The sight of British trucks unloading supplies no longer provoked only resentment. It also carried relief. Cooperation, once unthinkable, became practical. German administrators who had been cleared of Nazi affiliation worked alongside British officials to restore utilities and public services. Former enemies now sat at the same tables discussing sewage systems, electricity grids, and harbor repairs. In neighborhoods like hers, the mother watched the city change in increments. Windows were replaced with real glass instead of cardboard. Rubble piles shrank as organized cleanup efforts expanded. Her children returned to school part-time. Their cheeks slowly regained color. The cough that had frightened her during the winter became less frequent. She occasionally saw British soldiers on patrol, including the one who had helped her. Their interactions were never dramatic. A nod, a brief glance of recognition, nothing that would attract attention. But the memory of that moment remained powerful. It had altered the way she interpreted every subsequent encounter. Where she once saw only conquerors, she now saw individuals capable of choice. On a larger scale, political decisions were also shaping the future of Germany. Western Allied leadership increasingly concluded that economic collapse in Germany would endanger the entire continent. Reconstruction became a strategic priority. International aid initiatives and coordinated rebuilding plans began laying foundations for long-term stability. Industry was gradually revived under supervision. Trade routes reopened. The port of Hamburg, once a target of devastating bombing, slowly returned to life. None of this erased the past. The destruction caused by Nazi aggression remained undeniable. Millions across Europe had suffered under German occupation. Accountability processes continued. War crime trials unfolded. The moral reckoning was complex and often painful. Yet alongside justice, another force was quietly shaping the post-war order. Pragmatism guided by humanity. The recognition that sustainable peace required more than punishment. It required opportunity. It required preventing desperation from turning into future extremism.
For the British soldiers, the occupation evolved as well. Some returned home as demobilization accelerated. Others remained longer, participating in administrative transitions. Many carried with them memories not only of combat, but of ruined cities and difficult choices made after the guns fell silent. The mother's family eventually found modest stability. Her husband never returned, a loss shared by countless others. But her children survived. They grew up in a Germany very different from the one into which they were born. A Germany that over the following decades would rebuild its economy with remarkable speed. A Germany that would become integrated into a new European framework designed to prevent another catastrophic war. Looking back, historians often focus on treaties, economic plans, and geopolitical strategy. Those elements undeniably shaped the continent's future. But beneath those large forces were countless personal decisions, moments when individuals chose restraint over revenge, assistance over indifference. In the ruins of Hamburg, one such moment occurred when a soldier reached into his own ration pack and decided that regulations, while important, did not cancel compassion. He did not know he was contributing to the slow transformation of a city. He did not imagine that historians would later describe the occupation as a turning point in European stability. He simply responded to the human being in front of him. Peace is rarely built in grand speeches alone. It is built in ordinary encounters repeated thousands of times, in streets once defined by violence, in cities where suspicion slowly gives way to cooperation. Hamburg rose from ashes not because suffering was forgotten, but because enough people on both sides chose to move forward differently than before. And in that fragile period after the war, when everything seemed broken beyond repair, it was often the smallest acts that proved the strongest foundations for what came next.